The following is a community affairs presentation from the Ulster County Health Department. This is the Healthy Ulster Radio Show, a weekly presentation exploring community health and sustainability with guests representing a broad spectrum of community partners working to make Ulster County the healthiest in New York State. This program is sponsored by the Health Alliance of the Hudson Valley in Kingston, a member of the WMC Health Network.
Good morning. You are listening to Healthy Ulster Radio. I am your host, Dr. Carol Smith, Commissioner of Health and Mental Health for Ulster County. With me today is my co-host, Vin Martello, our Director of Community Health Relations. Good morning, Vin.
Good morning, Dr. Smith. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks.
Dr. Smith, today we have a very important topic that is on a lot of people's minds, and that is tick ecology and tick disease prevention. A big topic in these parts, and we are very fortunate to have a very accomplished scientist in the field. His name is Dr. Rick Ostfeld. He's senior scientist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. He's a disease ecologist, received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, and his expertise is in disease ecology, Lyme disease, and West Nile virus. Welcome, Dr. Ostfeld.
Welcome.
Thanks very much.
We're so happy to have you this morning.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Carey Institute, for instance, their mission, and what kind of work or research you do at that institute?
Yes, I'd be happy to. The Carey Institute is a private, non-profit, independent research institution in Millbrook over across the river in Dutchess County. So we're unaffiliated with any universities, although members of our scientific staff sometimes have adjunct appointments at local universities as well. So we are an ecological research institution. Our mission is to understand how nature works. The individual scientists there choose scientific questions the same way that any other academic scientist would. What do we think is most important and most interesting? And so we pursue things like the ecology of the Hudson River, the ecology of eastern forests, and we have a strong group that looks at the ecology of infectious diseases, including my group looking at tick-borne disease.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you right literally in the Hudson Valley and working with problems such as ticks and tick-borne illnesses, which certainly are on the minds of many of our residents, and certainly at this time of year when we become more active in the outdoors and are otherwise exposed more readily to ticks and the illnesses they carry. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of your current research on ticks and tick-borne illnesses in our area?
Yes, I'd be happy to. We are undertaking several projects on ticks and tick-borne illnesses, and we study them in their natural context. So we cast a broad net. We're interested in what influences how many ticks there are and how many of them are infected with what pathogens. So those two things, tick abundance and tick infection, together determine our risk of getting sick if we go out into tick habitat, which is all around us here in this area. So we have a long-term monitoring program at the Carey Institute, which we undertook back in the early 1990s. So we're coming up on 25 years of monitoring small mammals like mice, chipmunks, squirrels, their abundance, their population fluctuations through time. We have determined that the way that these small mammals fluctuate is determined to a large degree by how many acorns are produced by the oak trees that dominate these forests. So we collect data on trees. It's not just animals. We sample every year, multiple times a year, for the abundance of ticks, and then we take those ticks back to the lab and we sort of take pleasure in grinding them up and subjecting them to molecular analyses to determine what pathogens they're carrying: Lyme disease, babesiosis, anaplasmosis, Powassan virus, things like that. We also do some field experiments. We have added acorns to plots in the forest. We have removed mice, which is a very difficult thing to do. Anyone with mice that invade their homes knows how hard it is to keep the mice out. We have looked at the viruses, not just Powassan virus, but other kinds of viruses that occur in these animals, etc. So Most recently, we've undertaken a very practical, very what we call applied research over in Dutchess County, where we are using our hard-earned knowledge about the ecology of tick-borne disease to actually try to protect people's health by doing a good enough job of killing enough ticks in the right places to reduce the incidence rates of tick-borne disease in residential areas within Dutchess County. And I'd be happy to talk about that if you're interested at some point during the...
Sure, yeah, we'd love to hear about it now. I mean, how does one go about eliminating large number of ticks, especially in select areas?
Well, so what we have chosen sites in Dutchess County that we know have very high incidence of tick-borne disease, and they tend to be residential neighborhoods, for the most part fairly high-intensity residential areas with small lot sizes in and around villages within the county. And we are deploying two different types of tick-killing interventions. One of them is a naturally occurring microscopic fungus. It has the lovely name of Metarhizium anisoplii. So it's a naturally occurring fungus. It exists in North American forests, and it makes its living attacking and killing arthropods, including insects and ticks. So there's a strain of this fungus that's particularly virulent against ticks, but it doesn't kill a lot of the other organisms that we don't want to be killing. So, for instance, we don't want to be killing butterflies or honeybees or spiders. So it's fairly specific to ticks, and it does a good job at killing them. But it's not a chemical pesticide, although you spray it on like it was a chemical pesticide. The other intervention is a thing called a bait box. It's a small plastic box about the size of a bread box, actually. It has two holes in it that allow small mammals like white-footed mice and chipmunks to enter, which they want to do because there's a food reward on the inside of the box. But to get to the food, they have to brush past a little wick that applies a substance called fipronil. That's the main agent in Frontline, which people put on their dogs and cats. And that kills the ticks on the mice and the chipmunks. It's those ticks that are particularly important in the Lyme epidemic, because ticks feeding on mice and chipmunks in particular are very likely to survive, and so mice in particular are good at boosting the abundance of ticks, and it's the mice and secondarily the chipmunks that infect the ticks with Lyme disease, with babesiosis, and with anaplasmosis. So if we can kill the ticks on these little rodents, we're removing the ones that are likely to be the most dangerous.
And what is the efficacy of the fungus that you described?
In various small-scale trials, it is almost as effective as some of the synthetic pyrethroids, like bifenthrin, which many pest control companies use as their chemical of choice to spray on people's yards. So it's quite effective, but it does not have a lot of those bad side effects that the chemical pesticides have, being dangerous to wildlife, causing environmental damage in some cases, and certain toxicities. This Metarhizium fungus does not do those things, so it's much safer and essentially just as effective.
And is it expensive? And the second question is it getting close to becoming commercially viable and helpful?
It is a bit expensive, but it is commercially available. In fact, both of these products, we chose them because they're commercially available, because they're known to work, and because they are safe for the environment and for people and their pets. They're both a little expensive for my tastes, but it's my hope, and I'm a scientist, not an economist, so it's my hope, but not. I can't assure you that with an economy of scale, if our trials are effective, if they work, that they will become less expensive because there will be many communities that will want to adopt this strategy for reducing ticks.
It seems like a pretty interesting,
fascinating, absolutely
effective response. A question that people always have: do all ticks carry tick-borne diseases, or what is the general percentage when you collect and investigate?
Right. So mostly what we study are the black-legged ticks that some people call deer ticks. Actually, their correct name is the black-legged tick. And that species is the one responsible for Lyme, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis in our area, in the eastern half of the United States, in fact. On average, about 30% of the nymph stage ticks are infected with Lyme disease. And the nymph stage is the one responsible for the great majority of human cases of tick-borne illness. That's the stage that starts to become active in May, June, and into July in our area. So that's the really risky time of year.
And their size, they're so small that they can go unnoticed very often, even in the most diligent of searches.
Absolutely. They are very tiny, and not only are they hard to see, but they're very hard to feel. So I've watched nymphal ticks crawling on my skin, and you'd think that you would feel them as they're crawling across your arm or your leg or the back of your neck. But oftentimes you can't either feel them or see them. So they're particularly difficult. Although tick checks do turn them up, and it's important to do those tick checks because you have a fighting chance of finding them, but they're tiny enough to escape our notice.
And some of if you shower after coming in from the outdoors, very often if the tick has not attached yet, you may have the ability to just wash it away if you catch it while it's still crawling around. But again, that's a time consideration there and not always possible.
You may. I mean, they can hang on pretty tenaciously even if they haven't yet embedded their mouth parts. So you might get lucky and wash it off, but there's no substitute for doing a very thorough
tick check.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Right. I remember when my daughter was younger, it was quite easy. She was a very small child, so I would do a head-to-toe tick check every night with a high-intensity flashlight. But, of course, as they get older, that's not really appropriate. So I worry. She says, Dad, I do a tick check every night, but I don't think it's as thorough as it used to be, and it concerns me.
It's a problem, and you're right that as kids get a little bit older, they're going to be more responsible for doing their own tick checks, and I wish we could trust them to do as good a job as we do as parents, but sometimes they don't. And in fact, the demographic group that has the highest incidence rate of Lyme disease in the country are boys of about 8 to 12 years of age. So in many cases, no longer being checked by their parents, and perhaps not so fastidious on their own. I'm just saying.
And living outdoors. I remember our brother and I spent 97% of our childhood outdoors in every season, and it was just, you hate to tell your kids don't go outside, but there's reason to worry.
There is, and there is reason to worry, but there are also things we can do to protect ourselves to the degree that hopefully it won't prevent us from actually using the out of doors, because there's so many healthy benefits of outdoor time. We wouldn't want to just avoid going out there just because there are ticks around.
Right, and we'd like to learn more about what those measures are, but right now we're going to take a very short break. You're listening to Healthy Ulster Radio, and our guest is Dr. Rick Ostfeld from the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. We'll be back after these words.
In emergency care, it's all about experience. At Health Alliance Hospital Broadway campus, a member of the Westchester Medical Center Health Network, it's another way we're investing in you. We're board certified in emergency medicine, nationally recognized in stroke care, and use telemedicine to give patients access to the region's leading specialists. Patients tell us we make their experience exceptional by treating them with the utmost respect. Health Alliance Hospital Broadway campus. We're advancing care here. Visit hahv.org for more.
Welcome back. You are listening to Healthy Ulster Radio. Our special guest today is Dr. Rick Ostfeld, a senior scientist at the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies. Dr. Ostfeld, can you tell us a little bit more about the trends you are seeing in terms of the types of diseases that these ticks in our area are presenting with?
Sure. Yes, I mean, it used to be just Lyme disease. That was the only game in town. It's not a game, actually, but the only tick-borne disease we really needed to worry about. That entered into the Hudson Valley in mostly in the mid to late 1980s, and it sort of galloped its way up the Hudson River. And it's also moved out to the west and beyond the Capital District up into the Adirondacks and the like. In the 1990s, we saw anaplasmosis arrive and start to spread in a very similar fashion. Anaplasmosis was called ehrlichiosis, so there's a fair bit of confusion about those two things, but it's anaplasmosis, the correct name now, transmitted by the same black-legged ticks. And then a little bit after that, the early 2000s, we saw babesiosis arrive in our area and begin to spread. So we know, based on our studies at the Carey Institute, that a fair number of ticks are actually infected with more than one of those pathogens. So a single tick bite can possibly transmit to you 2 or even 3 of those tick-borne pathogens. So you can get a triple whammy from one tick bite, and that's very important for people to be aware of, and
these
physicians as well.
pathogens are not all the same. You're talking about a spirochete, intracellular type of an organism with babesiosis, so they're somewhat different. Some fall in the category of bacteria and others viruses, such as Powassan virus, which is one of the newer agents that we're seeing expanding into our area.
That's right, and so it's important for people, members of the public, and the healthcare community as well, to know that sometimes patients will become sick with more than one of these. And you're right, they're very different organisms, and often there are different treatments for each of them. So one might get doxycycline for Lyme disease and anaplasmosis, but it's not terribly effective against babesiosis. There are other medicines, and it does absolutely nothing against a viral infection. In fact, there's really little we can do to try to clear the virus in that case. So we need to be aware of the possibility that patients can be sick with more than one, and that being clobbered by 2 or even 3 of these diseases at the same time can result in a much more severe illness than simply having Lyme, which itself can be severe in some cases. So when we don't know all the reasons why these ticks and tick-borne diseases have been spreading geographically so rapidly, there is some evidence from our lab group and several others that climate warming is inducing the expansion of tick populations into more northerly areas and also up in elevation. So these were areas that we think were formerly too cold, too harsh an environment to support healthy tick populations. I mean, healthy to the tick, not to us. And as the climate warms, that increases the territory that is hospitable to ticks and allows them to invade new areas. And that looks like is what is responsible for the movement up into northern New England, northern New York, and higher elevation areas, the Catskills, the Adirondacks, and similar.
What is the minimum temperature that ticks can survive in the winter months?
Well, so ticks do fine in our cold winters. Another area where ticks are abundant is in the upper Midwest, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, where the climate is even more severe than it is here. So ticks are able to get down into the leaf litter, into the soil. They find these protected little tiny microsites where they can do perfectly well in a cold snap or in one of these polar vortex situations. They don't really care that much. If you had them in the laboratory below freezing at all, you'd kill them in an hour. So, but they're able to find tiny little protected places and avoid those harsh conditions. The warming climate looks like it increases habitat suitability by giving them a longer season over which they can find hosts. So that looks like is the mechanism by which warming increases the habitat quality for these ticks and allows them to expand.
So a longer feeding cycle is what you're saying.
A longer feeding cycle. And these ticks, as tiny as they are, need a couple of years, a full 2 years to live out their life cycle, and they need to feed 3 times, once as a larva, once as a nymph, and once as an adult in order to live out their life cycle and make babies and more ticks. So they need a long time, they need a long season, and if it's too short of a season, too brief of a warm period, then they can't live out their life cycle and you don't get a population.
Interesting. And so we already talked a little bit about black-legged ticks and mice carriers. What other ticks do we need to be aware of, and hosts for that matter?
Well, the other ticks that we find in our area that are important medically or to the veterinary practice and our pets is mostly the dog tick, the American dog tick. And that's a species that carries the pathogen that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. We occasionally see in our area the Lone Star tick. That is essentially an invader from the south. I think it will become more and more common in our area as time goes on. It's moving northward. We do see it in the lower Hudson Valley and to some degree in the mid-Hudson Valley. And it carries ehrlichiosis and also the pathogen that causes a disease called star eye, southern tick-associated rash illness. So those are the main ticks in our area that we need to worry about. The rest of the ticks, there are plenty of them. They just are restricted to wildlife. They live sometimes their whole lives in burrows or in nests, and they're not particularly interested in biting people. But the black-legged tick, the dog tick, and the Lone Star tick would be happy to bite us, so we need to watch out for them.
Interesting. And you talked earlier about your studies in Dutchess County in more suburban neighborhoods close to villages. But what about those of us who live in more rural areas, as compromises much of Ulster County?
Sure.
What do we have to be aware of and know about reducing tick habitat?
Right. So, these black-legged ticks really are a forest creature. They do best in areas that have a pretty good shade from trees for the most part, although they can also live under the shade of shrubs. And occasionally they hang around in taller grass, but grassy areas without a forest overstory are generally not as good an area for these ticks. They're less abundant. So anywhere where there's forest can be a risky place. You can find ticks. Some of those ticks can be infected and you can get sick as a result. What we have found through quite a large number of studies and a number of years of doing this work is that if the forest is extensive, if you're in a protected area with extensive forest, what that does is it promotes high diversity of various different kinds of mammals and birds. You get the whole complement of animals that you'd expect in this part of the world. Many of those animals actually protect our health. Inadvertently, of course, but they do so either by preying on the white-footed mice, so I'm thinking of owls and hawks, bobcats, foxes are particularly important, and others of them compete with mice and suppress mouse numbers as a result. So when you have a full complement of diverse mammals and birds, you get fewer ticks and fewer of those ticks being infected. Contrast that to a situation where we chop up the forest into little bits because we're putting in suburban developments or we're putting in an industrial park or we've got suburbanization going on. What that does is it discourages the larger bodied animals and the more predatory animals. They tend to disappear or at least get more scarce, and the mice have a field day. So the mice become much more abundant. And that means more ticks get to feed on mice. That means the ticks survive well and get infected at a very high rate. So to some extent, to the degree that we can protect natural areas, extensive forest, without chopping it up into bits, we will be protecting our health as well as the environment. And that's one of these rare win-win situations for the environment and human health.
It also so well illustrates that delicate balance of nature where, if you disrupt the balance through any of the human interventions or interference, that you throw off that balance, and very often the consequences are dire. You have the abundance of ticks and diseases borne by ticks. So, it's a very important lesson in how we need to respect the balance of the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think, we don't do it intentionally, but in a sense, we create a worst-case scenario when what we do is we begin to fragment the forest, chop it up into bits, and that means more ticks and higher percentage of those ticks infected. And then we plop our houses right there in the riskiest places. So we put our kids and ourselves and our pets right in harm's way. We don't mean to. But that's a consequence of certain types of development, and we could be more careful and do a better job of developing the landscape in a way that doesn't harm our health.
For those of us, development patterns certainly are critical, and I know a little bit about that, having been a former town supervisor. But for those of us who already live where we live, what measures can we take as individuals, property owners, family members, and so on, to mitigate, prevent tick habitats or diseases?
Well, there's not a lot that can be done in terms of landscaping. There are recommendations that you can find. Many of those are actually not supported by very rigorous science. But one thing that people can do to protect themselves and members of their family is to use repellents. So these would be, there are various kinds of repellents that work on mosquitoes and ticks. And there are sprays that you can put on your clothing that are permethrin-based sprays, or by pre-treated clothing. Those are very effective at repelling and also killing the ticks that are trying to get on you. So those are recommended, and it's particularly important to treat shoes and socks because these nymph stage ticks are looking for you from the ground or very low vegetation. So treating low on your body, not just your shirt sleeves, is very important.
Wow, this is really great, and I wish we had more time because it certainly is a timely topic and one that's
Absolutely.
very, very important. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Ostfeld here today, and thank you so much for all the work you do, you and your colleagues do.
Absolutely. It's wonderful that you're within the Hudson Valley, and we appreciate your work and wish you much success in that work.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back again. And that's about it for now. You're listening to Healthy Ulster Radio. Tune in next week for more great information that you can use to keep yourself, your family, and your community healthy and strong.
You've been listening to the Healthy Ulster Radio Show, a community affairs presentation from the Ulster County Health Department, sponsored by Health Alliance of the Hudson Valley in Kingston, a member of the WMC Health Network. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us for another edition of the Healthy Ulster Radio Show next week.